Okay, the next speaker is Simon Smalley from the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
Thank you, Ron, and thank you to the World Bank and IAIA for the invitation to speak today. I haven't been involved in environmental impact assessment of any kind for around about 15 years, like I heard some of our other speakers say this morning. And my presentation perhaps reflects a bit upon where I've moved to in my own career. And so I'm not going to talk very much about project-level environmental impact assessment. I'm going to talk much more about how governments actually need to fundamentally change some of the things that they do through policy change because of the fact that we've got all of these residual, or if you like, legacy issues of activity that is currently happening and will be influenced by climate change. And I'm going to do that by talking about, in particular, a couple of examples of our agricultural systems and our water policy. Firstly, just to look at our federal environmental impact assessment process. We don't actually have a trigger for climate change. Our legislation is very similar to that was explained for Canada this morning. It's based upon significance of effects, significance upon valued ecosystem components, and really focused on mitigating those kinds of issues. But climate change is not a trigger for environmental impact assessment. We do operate in a federal environment, so we have state governments, and the examples that Shardul spoke of this morning were examples of climate change being considered within project environmental impact assessment, and they were done at state level. There is, however, a review of that legislation that has just been completed, and that legislative review did suggest that in the absence at this stage of any market-based proposals that Australia has been seeking to move towards for putting a price on carbon, that we do put in place a trigger, and it suggested a trigger of greenhouse gas emissions of 500,000 tonnes from a project, which still doesn't go to the kinds of issues that I'm interested in, which is environmental impact assessment being constrained to new proposals of policies, plans or projects, but we needed to reform existing activities because we are seeing climate change occurring within Australia. This is a map of Australia, and this is a straight line trend over 30 years of the temperature changes at surface level. Sorry, this one's actually the rainfall. There's a very similar one for temperature. But it shows the decline in rainfall over that 30-year period. And Australian farmers are now very used to planning their seasonal agriculture, expecting variability. But from here on, it's just going to get more and more difficult for them. In 2009, Australian agriculture contributed 16% of our greenhouse gas emissions, and 2/3 of that is from livestock activities. Most of our agricultural production occurs in the areas that are shown as receiving much less rainfall in this kind of area here and throughout that zone there with livestock production as well as grain production. So it's going to be significantly impacted by climate change. We've done some economic analysis of what will happen to Australian agricultural output if we don't adapt nor mitigate, and done that on the basis of our CSIRO scenarios for climate change, and looked at both the 2030 projections and the 2050 projections. And production levels decline by around about 9% for all of those commodity outputs from agriculture in 2030, and by substantially more, between 13 and nearly 20% for beef, for instance, in 2050. So what are we doing about it in policy reform terms? One of the things that the government is very keen to ensure is that farmers actually manage their own business risks. In the OECD data, Australia sits with New Zealand as being the lowest subsidisers of agricultural production, and we're moving towards removing some of the even large forms of risk management that we provide them, and moving from crisis management to risk management. At the moment, we give crisis management assistance, and that actually has a fairly substantial budget impact for us. But these are the kinds of tools that we are looking to use, much more about accepting that climate change is occurring and undertaking a trial using these policy tools to get farmers, their families and their rural communities to prepare for the future challenges of climate change. We're also undertaking a substantial amount of climate change research to support the policy reforms and to assist with individual practice at a farming level. The program is funding large-scale collaborative projects that involve a range of organisations and research providers, industry groups, universities and the state governments, and it's being coordinated through a central point through our CSIRO, which is our major public-funded research organisation. The projects focus on reducing greenhouse pollution. It focuses also on better soil management and climate change adaptation, and will involve opportunities for our agricultural producers to respond to climate change and to manage the emissions while improving their productivity. And for the investments that we are making of $46 million, we're getting a combined research agenda of over $130 million that's being invested in. So that's briefly all I wanted to say about where we're going with agricultural policy change and the research that's backing it up. Just a few remarks about water policy reforms in Australia and how that's reacting to climate change. Our water reform processes started in 1994. They were refreshed in 2004 and then extended with a federal government takeover, in effect, of our major water basin where 40% of our agricultural production occurs in 2008. Effectively, the first wave of water reforms was to commoditise water, separate the land and water entitlements and set up trading systems for water. That's allowed water to be used throughout the last 10 years of drought that we faced in the places where our permanent crops can get the best value for money out of water. And it's meant that those opportunistic uses for water, such as rice growing or cotton, have actually reduced their use of water and has been traded downstream. The current framework for taking forward since 2008 the water reforms is to put in place now a statutory-based water plan across 3 states and 1 capital territory for a single basin, and to reframe the basin water use in terms of how much is allocated to the environment and how much is allocated to human uses. And of the human use side, 70% of it, of course, in our environment is used for agriculture. So it's changing that balance, and it means that agriculture has to get substantially more efficient and that the environment will get a better deal and be more sustainable. That's being done taking into account the impact of climate change, and that's being done through assessing the current and future scenarios of water availability across that basin, and it's being done in other states as well, so that we can understand what water is available in the long run and then make those allocated processes through plans that will be robust for the future. There are other bits and pieces that are also involved in that future process so that the industries and the social environments are also taken care of, but it is being done with a climate change scenario being built into it. So the key points from me are that Australian agriculture and water are very vulnerable to climate change, and that we are taking action through policy reforms, because to deal with legacy issues and big suites of issues like this, you need to do more than just focus on the projects and focus on new approvals through impact assessment. Thank you.
Thanks much, Simon. It was a good compliment to the analysis part to say, well, we have to deal with this and put it in the management context, which is a very good balance.